In today's video, I'm going to show you another Soviet designed landmine. This one is the PMD-6 series of anti-personnel landmines. This was designed before World War II. It was first encountered during the Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union in 1939. The Soviets used it very heavily during World War II. The Germans copied it, and their version was the shcu-mine 42. When you look at the pictures, they're very similar. This landmine, because of its very easy design for production, it's one of those blueprints or designs that was handed out by the Soviets after World War II to the different national liberation fronts and communist insurgencies around the world. It's still being produced today. This is a simple wooden box mine, and just like with the TMD Bravo, it has serious limitations when it comes to exposure to moisture, exposure to water. The wood starts to rot very quickly, so they do not last in the ground for very long. Now, this picture I'm showing you here, I'll just mention, is a variation of it, where they had a container inside, a glass container filled with picric acid. There was a glass tube that was inserted into it, and that tube was the cap well, blasting cap well, for the firing device and the detonator system. Now, the firing device for it was a MUV series fuse, MUV, and attached to it was the MD2 detonator. They came in two separate pieces that you would screw together before you put it inside the mine, and because it was variable, you could put in different types of MUV series fuses. You could have one that was a pressure fuse, you could have one that was a pull fuse, another one that was a pull release. You know, it varied according to the purpose that you needed it for. Now, I was going to do this video outdoors, but it's way too windy outside today for me to be able to do it, so I decided to move indoors. If you want to see pictures on how these were put in the ground, check online. There's a few pictures. They're not the greatest, but it should give you somewhat of an idea. Now, here's the one that I built, or one of the ones that I built. Technical details. It is 8 inches in length. It is supposed to be 2.5 inches high. This one that I produced here that I'm showing you is 3.5 inches high, and that's because of the thickness of the wood. And it is supposed to be 3.5 inches wide. But this one, because of the wood, is 4 inches wide. The weight of the mine is less than a pound. I came out to, when I did the conversion, to about 0.88 pounds. The actual explosive content inside was usually around ½ a pound. Now, I came across that the actual production ones made by the Soviets in World War II employed TNT. But I found variants that used other explosive materials. Like in the photo, they had picric acid versions. I found references to ammonium nitrate being used in one version. And there are also variants that used dynamite. Now, dynamite and TNT are not always the same thing, okay? Military dynamite is not TNT, I can tell you that. It is another substance. similar to or based off of TNT, but it's not the same. So now this particular mine that I made for you, I used materials that I could get a hold of, and the wood I used for it is from wooden pallets. All the wood on this mine is from a pallet. I did not use any scrap wood. Now the particular pallet I used was what's referred to as a white wood pallet. It's the unpainted pallets. Those are considered pretty much garbage anywhere that you encounter them, around a store or a warehouse or a manufacturing facility. Usually they'll have a scrap wood pile and they'll have some pallets tossed on there. Just ask them if you can get some pallets, and there you got some wood. Now this particular one here, I did have to make some changes compared to the actual pictures of the PMD-6 using what I had available. First off, the wood is thicker than an actual PMD-6. When you look at pictures of the PMD-6 mines, it looks like that's almost a 1/4 inch or maybe at most a 3/8 inch wide piece of wood. This stuff is around 1/2 inch thick. Now, as you see here in the picture, I got my simulated 1/2 pound block of TNT in here and my simulated fuse. As I mentioned, this type of mine typically uses a MUV series fuse, MUV. I do not have an actual MUV series type fuse for showing for training because they cost too damn much. So I had to make something that was similar or was at least good enough. Now, if you're going to design one of these for a display and you want to copy what I did, I used a 30 caliber casing. This particular one is 7.62 by 54R. I have a training aid blasting cap which I glued into the neck of the casing. And then back here, my striker is a nail that I drilled the back of the casing out through the primer and then pounded that through with a hammer. I made sure that that hole was deliberately tight to hold it in place. And then I made a pin here which would simulate this pin here for the pressure type MUV fuse. And then I glued that onto my striker. Now when I put this mine together, I will just say this, because I'm using different type of wood, different thickness of wood than the actual PMD-6, I first went off what are the dimensions of the explosive charge I was putting inside, and then I built the mine around that. First the bottom half of the casing, then I built the upper part of the casing, the actual pressure plate around that so that they would fit together correctly. I put a hinge inside here, which I don't doubt some of them have been done with hinges, but when you look at a lot of the pictures, what they did is they bored holes in the sides here, and they would either run a piece of rod all the way through, or they would use 2 nails, one on each side, creating the hinge right here on the wood itself. Now I nailed this particular one together. When you look at the pictures of the real PMD-6s, they are jointed. Not quite dovetail jointed, they're just jointed together, notched out, fitted together, and glued together. Now when these mines first were encountered during World War II, they were extremely hard to detect because of the low metallic content. At that time, if you're going off an actual PMD-6, the only metal inside would have been the fuse. Maybe you had a couple nails up here for the hinge for the top part of the mine. So for the mine detector technology at that time, they were nearly impossible to pick up. Nowadays, there's more than enough metal here in this fuse alone that it would get picked up by a mine detector or metal detector. Now, how this particular mine works, the explosive content was put inside the mine. Otherwise you just had a wooden box. You had your hole already built or dug, or wherever you're going to emplace this mine. It could be used in urban warfare, so if you just change out for a different type of MUV fuse from a pressure fuse over to maybe a pull fuse or a tension release fuse. You put this by your hole, you then inserted your fuse through the front of the mine here. There was a hole drilled in this front piece of wood here, just big enough for the fuse body to fit through. The little pin, the push pin, was on the bottom side of the fuse. Then close the cover, not putting too much pressure on it. Put it into the hole, and then they would camouflage it. Now, how this would work, a person would step on this top plate here. You would push down on the pin here on the bottom of the striker. This would push down, pushing this pin out. The striker would be under spring pressure and would get pushed forward into essentially the primer part of the detonator, setting off the blasting cap. Now, there are different variants of this. Like I said, this is part of a series. I came across references to the PMD-6F, which apparently was manufactured around Leningrad during the siege of Leningrad. That one had a charge of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, because they could only bring in so many supplies into the area and they had to use what was available. So they made their own explosives, making an ANFO based explosive, somehow packaged it, put it inside the mine, and it came up with its own version of the series, the PMD-6F or PMD-6 Foxtrot. Another version, which I built and have here, was the PMD-7TS. Now, it's still essentially the same type of body, but instead of it being a wooden box for the bottom part of the body, it is a solid block of wood that is bored out. Now, on the pictures that I could find of the PMD-7TS online, they bored out a larger diameter hole from the back, and inside that would have been inserted a section of probably dynamite, and then on the front they had a smaller hole for the fuse. So it still would be fused through the front. Same principle. Pressure on top of the board presses through, removing the pin. Striker goes in, sets off the firing device. Now, I did change mine a little bit. First off, you'll probably notice I screwed up when I was boring this out, and I got a little too close with my spade bit when I was boring it out. So I got a little hole in it. But on mine here, instead of boring it from the back, I bored it out from the front so that it was wider, and then made a piece of board, piece of wood to put over the front. After the explosive would be inside, then this would be nailed in place for putting in the fuse. Now I'll mention this, I had a hell of a time making this one, far harder time making this one than the PMD-6. Mainly because I do not have the proper tools. I'll say this, if you try doing it like this, you're going to need a drill press. And your drill press needs to have the clamp that will hold this in the vertical position underneath the bit. You'll have to do 2 holes. Do not put them right next to each other, put a little separation between them. And then after you get the depth that you need, as the total as far as you can with your spade bit, then go through and use some wood chisels and remove that section in the center there to open this up. For those of you that are wondering how I made this. And this one, I actually went through and I did the hinge in back using the nails. Now this comes under multiple names around the world, or multiple models around the world, depending on the country that produces it, just like with the TMD Bravo. There are variations done to it according to techniques or improvements that were made in that country. One extremely interesting one I came across is the North Korean version. Now, the North Korean version, if you look at that, the fuse is essentially completely contained inside the box. There is no hole in the front. Not on the lid, not on the box itself. So the mine would be a little bit longer. The fuse is self-contained inside, so they would insert the fuse in the explosive charge, put it inside the mine, and inside here they had a piece of wood that's going across, and the fuse would be set in there like this, inside the channel of the wood, with the little wings on the striker here on the top of that bridge of wood, which would look like this. Had that little notch in there just wide enough for the striker. And then on the lid, the inside of it, they had a piece of wood up in here that as the mine would close, that would push down on the front of the striker, forcing the firing device downward, removing the pin, and then that would detonate the mine. By doing it that way, it would cut down on moisture getting inside the mine. I thought that was a pretty interesting variation on it. I also came across pictures of PMD-6s where they, and it also mentioned as its own separate variant, where they had a piece of metal in here, just a thin piece of metal, very light gauge metal, that would act as kind of a spring, so that as you're arming it, you wouldn't push down too far, detonating the mine. That little piece of metal would come in contact with the fuse body, keeping it from closing too soon while the person's putting it in. Just an additional safety. I also came across references to a piece of metal, a metal rod that was drilled in from the side here going across near the top, and that would act as a safety pin for while you're putting the mine in the ground, and after the mine's in the ground you remove the pin out the side. I also came across a variation where they put the pin going long ways across on the top here from the front, and it went right over the top of the explosive block, and then when the mine was put in the ground, that rod was removed, and then the fuse would be able to be activated then. So this is a very interesting mine. There's lots of variations on this, and really you go with the materials you have available, and according to your skills, what you're able to do. When I tried building both of these versions, I tried using only hand tools. So hand saws, hammers, screwdrivers, and that. When I got to the PMD-7 TS, I did require an actual power drill to bore it out, because I'm not sure how you would do this using just a plain old manual hand drill, especially if you're trying to bore it out like I did, so that it would take more of a charge. And that's what we have for this installment of mines and booby traps through history that you could encounter. The PMD-6 series anti-personnel mines. Oh, I do have one picture to show you that I did not yet. For the more technically minded, I will leave you with that picture. That is a disassembled MUV fuse, MUV. Now, for all my engineer brothers in the Patriot and militia movements, always remember, essay ons.